This is Louie, and if you want to support my channel, head on over to Play Asia. You don't want to go over to Play Asia? Head on over to J-List and see if there's some degenerate shit that catches your fancy. If you don't want to go over to J-List, head over to my Patreon account and support me there so you can get more videos by me talking about The Thought. Links can be found in the description.
So this is Louie, and I thought I would talk a little bit about Battlefield 5.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Huh? Zappuccino. Fucking spitting at me.
I thought the launch party would have been in November, but in Stockholm, Sweden, there was a launch party last night for DICE EA, and it featured this image, and I'm going to leave it on screen for a little bit so you can see it for yourself. I thought originally that this was a Photoshop. When I saw the first image, I was like, there's no way. There's no way that this is real. So I started doing some digging, and unfortunately, two of the original sources have since deleted their tweets of developers that were at the party. They just outright knew where this was going, and so they deleted their tweets. But the archives were still up of several different people that were at the party, and people captured the images. Unfortunately, the only example that I can showcase to you that this is real is from one PR person that was at the party. That's the only source that I currently have. The weird part of this, which is what's written on the screen, I actually found an article from some Swedish outlet where the exact sentences, like the quotes that are on that screen, are in this article. It's really weird. I'm not really sure where this is coming from, but apparently this has been in the works for over a month, that they were planning on representing this at this party, where whoever it was, some person at DICE EA, after this was displayed, gave a speech about quote-unquote equality. Now, as we all know, the entire reason why people don't like this, well, there's multiple reasons, but the primary reason is that people think of equality and they think of equality before the law. That's what they think of. They're not thinking of any sort of Marxist concept. They're not thinking of any feminist theory concept. They're thinking of legal egalitarianism. That is what's in their mind. This word is a sleight of hand, and the purpose of it is manipulation of normies. It is to convince somebody that they should not speak up. They should duck their head down. They should not say anything, because no one wants to be against equality. The issue is that what they mean by equality is in the same sense as, the Vietnamese killing their own citizens and laying them into a mass grave, alongside each other. That's equality. That's the kind of equality they're referencing. So I translated this article, and I'll leave it linked below for those of you that care to read it, to go ahead and read it. There's not really much of substance even in the translation, but it is a good source for where these quotes came from. And let me get up the image here, and we'll go through the quotes that we can see on screen. So the first quote in the corner is, "White men, white men, white men." Now that's supposed to be spooky scary, but the issue is that was a phrase that was banned from the game. And I'll try to find a source for that. That is why that quote is there, because that phrase, white men, was banned from the internal chat of the game. That's why it's there. Censorship. So that quote is actually a very good quote to have on screen, because you censored the game. You weren't allowed to say white men in the chat of that game, for whatever reason. The second quote that I'm going to point to is, "What the fuck was the developers thinking?" Now, what that is actually supposed to say, if people had grammar, is, what the fuck were the developers thinking? And guess what?
What were they thinking?
What were they thinking?
What were they thinking with this shitload of fuck? What were they thinking? What were they thinking? What were they thinking?
That is a direct reference to the angry video game nerd. I am confident that that is what this is referring to, because it is in the context of DICE EA fucking this game. How else am I supposed to take this when, I mean, maybe it's by somebody younger that doesn't know AVGN, but I have to imagine that this is a direct reference. And again, like the white men quote, it's not a bad quote. Because the whole purpose of it is making fun of these developers that fuck this game for seemingly no reason. Because as far as I can tell, the launch of this game has been a complete disaster, despite the fact that they pushed it back a month to not have to contend with, Red Dead Redemption and whatever else that came out in October. That was the reason why they pushed it back. It didn't matter. Did not matter remotely. This game is still selling poorly, and it deserves to. Absolutely. The other quote they have on screen is, "Feminism ruins everything. Feminazis are trying to rewrite history." Now, there's a problem with that quote, and it's not the fact that it's untrue. It is the glaring truth that comes with that quote. It's amazing to me that they would put that on the screen, because that is what you did in the game. And I'll link to American Krogan's video, which everyone is linking to because it's a good video on the topic. You did rewrite history. You did. In the game, through several of the stories, the campaigns, what have you, whatever you want to call them, there were 2 instances where you specifically rewrote it for the sake of pushing a narrative. One, which was to make the French look awful for the sake of propping up African soldiers that went on to have sex slaves, by the way. They call them wives in multiple instances. No, dude, they're sex slaves. You can't force a woman into marriage. That is sexual slavery, bro. That's not forced weddings. That is sexual slavery. The entire purpose of the marriage is to justify you raping the woman. Those are the soldiers you're propping up.
According to some historians and various personal accounts, back in Africa, they had a tendency to forcibly take women as wives or captives after they defeated enemies in battle. These were known as prises de guerre, and the French officers apparently went along with it so as to maintain order and recruitment quotas. A French woman, Madame Paul Bontin, in the account of her journey from Senegal to Niger in 1894 said, quote, "On a dû tolérer officiellement cette infamie afin de pouvoir empêcher les abus, et aussi parce que, supprimer la perspective de gagner captifs, le noir ne s'enrôlerait plus. Pas d'argent, pas de Suisse, pas d'esclaves rasiers, pas de soldats nègres." Unquote.
You're putting down the Frenchmen, making them all look like a bunch of racists and whatever else, but at the same time you're propping up a bunch of dudes that literally grabbed women and brought them back home and raped them. They took them as their sex slaves and made a stink about it. That was one of the things that Krogan brought up in his video was the officers, the French officers, had to look the other way for some of these guys to fight for them in taking sex slaves, to make sure they would fight. Okay? That is not moral. That is not something you should be propping up as a shining moment in fucking history. Anyways, the other quote is Genderfield 5, which speaks for itself. It's just a mocking nickname. And on the bottom there, it's hard to see, but it says, "Did my grandfather storm the beaches of Normandy for this?" And what that is a reference to is the fact that there were, 3 black Germans that fought in World War II? There were segregated black regiments in America. As far as I know, were there any black soldiers that fought for the English at all? The fact is that the overwhelming majority, the near totality of those that fought in World War II were white men. Also the Italians, if you want to lump them in. I don't really count them as whites. But if you want to lump the Italians in, and maybe the Japanese too. I mean, here's the question I pose to you. I know that I'm being a little bit, flippant here. Who is more white in your opinion? Italians or the Japanese? Because you got to ask yourself that. I mean, the Japanese have done some evil shit akin to the Germans. So does that make them more white? I mean, just look at how the Germans felt about the about the Japanese as well. You have to question who's more white, the Italians or the Japanese. Anyways, so the whole purpose of that quote is, again, pointing out the obvious, as I just said. Yes, those that were storming the beaches in Normandy, whether it was for the United Kingdom, the United States, or Canada, they were totality white men. And what you're doing is, in fact, diminishing that. You're diminishing the fact that those were the men that stormed the beaches. My grandfather was at Normandy. And like everyone else that did, he was lucky to have survived it. It was a fucking massacre. And it was a massacre that was, from based on my understanding of history, just a barely coordinated plan that was put forward as an ace in the hole to try to get into Europe, to break through the defenses and get into France. As far as I can tell, it was nothing more than, this is an ace up my sleeve and I'm willing to throw this many bodies on the line. And that's what happened. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of men died in that attack. And they knew that that was going to happen, and that there was a high chance of it failing. But it was just a matter of, the Russian model of, let's just throw enough bodies at these defenses and see if we can break through, and it succeeded. And by the way, I would not be here today if my grandfather hadn't have survived that. If he would have died on that beachfront, I wouldn't be here. But he survived and went on to get injured 2 more times in that war. I don't know if he was injured in Normandy. I'd have to look back at some of my family history to see if that where exactly he was injured in the campaign multiple that he served in. It was that the European theater, but he was involved in Sicily or Italy, depending on exactly where, and also in the Battle of the Bulge, which he was injured in but survived. My grandfather went through hell in that war. I don't think it's fair to just create fictional history when, in fact, many of our ancestors, many of the people who are playing that game, many of our ancestors, they were the ones who sacrificed in that war. And not everyone came home. I'm sure people have families where, uncles died and that sort of thing, or great uncles, etc. I'm sure that if you were to poll people, most people have some direct lineage to those that fought in that war. Canada, well, maybe less so now in Canada, but definitely in the United States, and I imagine in the UK, although less so now. I don't think it's fair that you can just sidestep the fact that these are the men that sacrificed in that war. If you want to invent some fantasy for a multiracial, multinational, whatever war, where all these different people of differing ethnicities, specifically non-white typically, they fought together instead of the fact that it was the United States fighting against the Japanese, for example. That was a conflict that was specific to the United States of mainly whites against entirely Japanese, I'd have to imagine. I don't know if the Japanese conscripted it all in the islands that they conquered in the Pacific, but it doesn't appear that that's what they did, as far as I understand history. They more likely genocided than they did fucking conscript, from my understanding. But the fact is that those sides were what they were back then. And it's not inaccurate to portray the Japanese as the antagonists during that conflict, because they were. They absolutely were. They were genociding everyone around them. They were invading every other nation around them. They were genociding the Chinese at the time, along with it wasn't just the Chinese, by the way. They genocided a lot of people back then when they conquered the Pacific. But in fact, they attacked us. That was the onus for the conflict. That was the onus for the war. People can say whatever justifications, the oil and whatever else. No, bro, they attacked us thinking that they were going to defeat us by that measure. They attacked Pearl Harbor. Now we just knocked out the Americans so we can continue our quest of conquering, oppressing, and genociding people on a whim, as far as I can tell. The Japanese back then absolutely were antagonists. And guess what? They weren't white. They weren't. And that's history. The fact is that it's a good thing that we're still there in Japan today. It's a good thing that we're still in control of their military. Because you can look at any kind of Pew polling, any polling you can find that you can get out of Asia. The Asians still fucking hate each other. And they would be in conflict today without us being there, controlling the entire goddamn region. The entire goddamn Pacific. If it weren't for us there, they'd still be in fucking conflict. But the fact is that they have peace over there, and they've had peace for decades and decades. The only exception would be, Southeast Asia, which is, Micronesia and fucking, Vietnam and that area. Outside of that, and even there, they've had peace for decades, generations even. And it's been because of us, specifically America. Maybe Australia to some limited degree, I'd imagine, but mostly the United States. Tens of thousands of men died for that peace. And this is what you are just shoveling into the fucking, George Orwell incinerators of history. You're attempting to rewrite history for the sake of false diversity. There wasn't diversity in that war. There wasn't. It was near totality white men against Italians, Germans, and the fucking Japanese. That was that war. But like I said, you want to invent a fantasy battle? Go ahead, go invent something else. Go invent some story where it's the Japanese and the Americans and whoever else, some African nation, fighting against aliens or something. Because that's the only way you're going to unite the people of this fucking planet. Feel free to add your input on how you feel about this. But to me, this is just another example of how Western gaming is not in a good place. And EA has apparently learned nothing. And the thing is, I know that EA DICE, or DICE specifically as a studio, they're virtue signalers. They always have been. I'll show you this image that I found of some stupid float they had in some gay pride parade where it's like, the battle's won, guys. So, to me, the whole thing with this is like, it's just cultural supremacy. That's all you're seeking in this. You already have legal equality. So after that point, now you just want supremacy. It's not about acceptance. It's about control. And that's what all of this is always about. That's what these people are. They're totalitarians, as I continue to say, because it is, in fact, true. But I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening.